Welcome to the State Library. I'm Carolyn Spooner, and I'm acknowledging that we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people and paying our respects to elders past and present. Welcome also to Joe Bain from the South Australian Museum. And friend, do you want to show them your little friend?
So I've just got my son's rat Rose with me today. She'll stay here and she won't bother anyone, so it's all good.
And hello to the people on the live stream.
Did I give you a kiss? Yeah, kiss.
Our story begins some 65,000 years ago, when the Kaurna people told their stories and kept their memories alive in their oral and artistic traditions. Fast forward to Adelaide, when the South Australian colony was established in 1836, and by 1849 there was little to see of the country in Adelaide as the Kaurna people knew it. When the Institute building, this building, opened in 1861, the library, museum and art gallery were under the one roof. George Beasley was the first museum taxidermist, appointed in August 1881. George arrived on the ship Liguria and waited on the Board of Governors. George Beasley was followed by the brothers Otto and Johann Rohr, then Otto's son, Alan Rohr. Looks as if taxidermy goes in dynasties. Then Paul Lawson, who we'll hear more of, Winston Head, and now Joe Bain today. So only 7 taxidermists since 1881. It's a very exclusive club. Bit like the curator at Adelaide Oval. There's only been 11 of them since 1875. Now, talking of sport, Alan Rohr played league football for Sturt in the 1920s. He was originally rejected because they thought he was too thin to play league football, hence the nickname Spider, I guess. And he played alongside the legendary Vic Richardson and was named Most Unselfish Player in 1926 in Sturt's premiership year. So taxidermists have other lives. When the Jervois wing, now called the Mortlock wing, was built in 1884, the taxidermist's workshop was in the basement. And we know this because we have 2 fabulous photographs of the taxidermists at work. The Rohr brothers, Otto and John, working on the tiger that is still in the museum today. And here we see them working on an albino kangaroo. And also on the bench is an eagle. This bald eagle was on display in the Mortlock wing after its redevelopment in 2004 to remember the connection between the library and the museum. Now, the word taxidermy derives from 2 innocent Greek words, taxis, meaning arrangement, and derma, meaning skin. The first mention that I could find in the South Australian newspapers on the website Trove was in 1838. Directions for collecting zoological specimens, which were based on a few books, one of which was Samuel's little work on collecting and preserving exotic insects and crustacea. And amazingly, the library has a later book by Samuel on British insects written in 1841. The article says, "We consider that we shall be doing our fellow colonists a service by furnishing them with what we consider a valuable manual of practical taxidermy. Entire skeletons, especially of the rarer animals, should be procured when possible. Take especial care that not a bone, tooth or claw be lost." And this long article went over 2 pages. A later article urged upon all colonists the duty of preserving from extinction the animals peculiar to Australia. We referred to the recklessness with which bushmen generally make war upon the birds and quadrupeds, as well as the reptiles which are to be found in our forests. The original lords of the soil seem destined to disappear before the white man has occupied the length and breadth of the land. But there can be no reason for dooming to more swift destruction the curious and beautiful creatures over which the Aboriginal exercised a less exterminating dominion. So they were aware, even in 1863, of the loss of species and habitat. Taxidermy was seen as part of the interest in natural history and collecting and preserving specimens. Cabinets of curiosities and glass domes showed your fancy work, and sometimes you can see them in second-hand shops. An article reprinted from Nature magazine appeared in the Mount Gambier newspaper, The Border Watch, in 1880. How birds are stuffed. In these days, when ladies are so often in want of a new pursuit, one that shall combine great pleasure and attraction, inasmuch as it pleases the eye and a sufficiency of knowledge to make it well worthy of the pains, I know of none more likely to afford enjoyment than taxidermy, as applied to stuffing birds. Now, I'm not sure how these young ladies would have taken that piece of advice. Private taxidermists advertised in the newspapers. For example, bird skins for sale, a small quantity of skins of South Australian birds in good condition. W.H. Rogers, taxidermist, Eliza Street, Adelaide. And we can see Eliza Street in this beautiful 1936 map by W.H. Edmonds. And in the top right-hand corner, you might be able to see the Institute, Library, Museum, Art Gallery and University. New books arriving from England were advertised in the newspapers. So George Robertson was spruiking new and practical handbooks just received in 1880. There's rose growing, dressmaking, flower decorating, beekeeping, and Brown's Practical Taxidermy, instructions in collecting and preserving natural history specimens, 3 shillings and 6pence. The library actually has another book by Montague Brown from a bit later, Artistic and Scientific Taxidermy and Modelling, a manual of instruction in the methods of preserving and reproducing the correct form of all natural objects, including a chapter on the modelling of foliage. So this is more of a professional book rather than one for amateurs. So here's one of the chapters on accessories to the finished product for exhibition, such as the foliage. So in this case, modelling apple blossom from fabric. In the back of the book is the evidence of its borrowing history, back in the days when the State Library used to lend our books. Now there are some country lending service borrowers. I can see the little CLS. The first is from Bulloo Creek, which is west of Broken Hill. The other one is from Tantanoola, down in the southeast. And if you know your South Australian history, there was the legend of the Tantanooga tiger in the southeast in the 1890s. Anybody remember the Tantanooga tiger? Yeah. Turns out it was some sort of wolf, not a tiger, and the local hotel keeper had it taxidermied, and he put it on display in the Tantanooga Tiger Hotel, which sadly I believe is now closed. But there's been a book written about it, and the local football team had the tiger as their mascot. Returning to our story, in the old days, donations to the museum, library and art gallery were listed in the newspapers each month. Here are the donations to the taxidermist department for January 1888. Miss Annie Geyer of Greenock donates a collection of birds' eggs. The Zoological Gardens donates a cuckoo, a wombat, a golden cat, an Asia coot, an echidna and a badger. C. Phillipson donates a boot found on Thistle Island and supposed to have belonged to Sir Joseph Banks, naturalist to Captain Cook's expedition. I don't think Joseph Banks actually came to South Australia, did he? Then A. Collin of Cassini on Kangaroo Island donates 5 live wallabies. That sounded a bit odd, but it was true, because under the heading Wild Animals Stuffed, a reporter visits Mr. Beasley, the government taxidermist, and confirms that it is not unusual to find living creatures in that catacomb of which Mr. Beasley is the presiding genius. And on that day, there were a couple of juvenile pelicans that he was working on. Then we find the smell of tons of half-rotten, stinking bones from whale carcasses being processed on North Terrace was strong, and G. Francis wrote to the editor complaining about it. So we're here in the South Australian Institute, and behind this building there was a macerating house, a gas house, a whale house, and a fumigating chamber. An article in the paper describes the taxidermists at work, preparing the bones of a whale for maceration, which is the process by which all the substances clinging to the bones, together with the oil, was removed. The bones were thrown into large tubs and covered with water, and in about 18 months they would be clean. Eventually these large tubs were no longer used, but in 1934, on the 17th of January, the news reported on its front page, "Librarian swim in whale's tank." The coolest spot in the heart of Adelaide at noon today was the new swimming pool at the rear of the public library. It was full of sparkling water, 9 feet deep, and in it were several men and women, members of the staffs of the public library, museum and circulating library, in gay bathing suits and diving caps. They dived from a board that was once an incinerator. The pool was made out of an old tank which had once been the last resting place of whales brought to the museum. It provides swimming space of 19 feet 6 inches by 14 feet. From 8 a.m. until 9 a.m. and throughout the lunch hours, staff members splashed happily in the pool, which is thought to be the only one attached to a public library in the British Empire. But as well as swimming in the whale tanks, the librarians were doing their main business of building up library collections. Let's look at some of the 24 books we've got on taxidermy. The oldest one is from 1818 by William Bullock. It has one of those long 19th century titles, "A concise and easy method of preserving objects of natural history, intended for the use of sportsmen, travellers and others, to enable them to prepare and preserve such curious and rare articles they may wish to transmit in safety to any part of the world." It's tiny, only 36 pages, so it's designed to fit into the coat pocket of sportsmen and travellers. It has some instructions on spreading the fins of fish on paper and setting a butterfly. And at the end, the owner's written some handwritten notes with instructions for destroying insects in the quill of any feather. Corrosive sublimate to be pounded small and added to spirits of wine. The quill to be dipped in it and shaken while dry. There will be a sediment which must be taken away. So you can see the long S's there, so it's so great to have the writing of somebody from the time in the book. William Temple Hornaday was an American zoologist, conservationist and taxidermist. He was the first director of the New York Zoo, known today as the Bronx Zoo, and he was a pioneer in the early wildlife conservation movement of the United States. We have his 1891 book on taxidermy and zoological collection, a complete handbook for the amateur taxidermist, collector, osteologist, I think that's bones, museum builder, sportsman and traveller. And William Hornaday is known as the father of the American conservation movement. Hornaday writes in the chapter on mounting small animals, "In conclusion, do not expect that your first mammal is going to be an overpowering success. Do not take a cat for your first subject, for a cat is the most difficult of all small quadrupeds to mount successfully. A tough old squirrel is the best thing for you to wrestle with until you have learnt the method thoroughly." Now, what would be the Australian equivalent of a squirrel? Possum, poor old possum. into the 20th century, this little book is my favourite. It's just called Taxidermy, published in 1901, and it's actually part of a series of handbooks edited by an Australian, Paul Nooncree Hasluck, cobbled together from articles published in Work magazine. Again, small enough to hold or put in your pocket. Very practical information, simple instructions and diagrams. There's a chapter on skinning and stuffing mammals, which has an easy-to-make moleskin purse. Now, I know that R.M. Williams' moleskin trousers are made from brushed cotton, but from the body of a mole, a pretty little purse may be made. So it gives you instructions and says the tail is as well left alone, and at the end says, eyes need not be put in. Now form a bag of chamois leather to fit inside the body and finish as shown. I think that's hilarious. Home taxidermy is still a thing in 1969, and the tools you need don't look too complicated. Christopher Stote talks about the revival of a natural art in 1987. And as well as the usual chapters on history, skins, birds and fish, he talks about taking care of your collections and the care of dead animals in the field. Get Stuffed, the Home Taxidermist Handbook by Chuck Iglesias from 2006 in our South Australian collection is our most recent How to Do It book. Or is it? How to stuff, mount and display your beloved critters around the home and yard. Now the penny dropped with the garden chess set. There's a tortoise, a Siamese cat, a bunny, a samoyed, a border collie and rats. And this little book is one of the items from the library and the museum that's in the little exhibit just outside the room, if you haven't seen it. But the back of the title page tells it like it is. Note, the information in this book is intended to be humorous and supplied for entertainment only. Oh. Now, at last, a book written by a woman. Melissa Milgram wrote Still Life, Adventures in Taxidermy in 2010, when she was working as a journalist for the New York Times. Immersing herself in the world of taxidermy, she finds out about William Hornaday, and eventually she decides she needs to have a go herself. So, I stuff a squirrel. These poor squirrels are really in for it. I wanted to mount a mammal, something suitably small and relatively easy, something ubiquitous and easy to observe even in New York City. She chose an eastern grey squirrel. She quotes William Hornaday, "Bad taxidermy is easy." She goes on to say that no formal training has ever been required to become a taxidermist, which adds to its idiosyncratic appeal. But she could have enrolled in the Academy of Realistic Taxidermy in Montana, or she could have just looked on YouTube for how to taxidermy a squirrel. Now, if you're getting interested in borrowing a book on taxidermy, you'll be pleased to know that our wonderful public library network, Libraries SA, has even more books than the State Library does. Yeah, so the two covers on the left are books I've talked about, but I love the title, Crap Taxidermy, a humorous look at what happens when taxidermy goes horribly wrong, by the founder of the hit website crappytaxidermy.com. And on the right, Crochet Taxidermy, 30 quirky animal projects from mouse to moose. So good on our public library network. And on the left, you can see that there are 32 books in the system, 9 ebooks, 8 in large print, and 4 audiobooks. Now, taxidermists crop up in fiction from time to time. They've got a similar macabre profile to undertakers. A character in Charles Dickens's Our Mutual Friend is Mr. Venus the taxidermist, seen here surrounded by the trophies of his art, So there are skeletons and dust, most unprofessional looking. And we have the first edition of this book from 1865. In our wonderful children's literature research collection are a couple of stories on our theme. One of the Hardy Boys mystery series, The Shortwave Mystery, where the Hardy Boys unravel a plot to hide electronic bugging devices inside stuffed animals, which are put in businesses and offices as artworks. Melbourne writer Sharon Kernow's The Art of Taxidermy was shortlisted for the Children's Book Council of Australia Book of the Year Award in 2018. It's a novel in verse where a young girl begins, "At the age of 11, I fell in love with death. I found a gecko in a dark corner of a room. Its lifeless lies open, its small bulbous toes splayed as if about to leap away. I wanted to keep it, to hold on. I wanted to preserve its lively expression. I placed it on my dresser." And at the end of the book, the young girl meets a taxidermist. She writes, "The taxidermist asked about my interests as he set up his tools on a glinting stainless steel bench. He told me that he had 3 dogs, 2 cats, 4 children and a wife. He said he had a normal life. He told me his father was also a taxidermist, that he never wanted to do anything else. If you are keen, I will help you skin and mount a hopping mouse. Perhaps one day you will join me at the museum." So we have a book on the Spinifex hopping mouse. Then we read, "Father approved of my first taxidermy piece. He held it up, studied it for a very long time. 'It's a fawn hopping mouse,' I said, 'Notomus cervinus, from the Lake Eyre Basin.' 'It is perfect,' Father said. 'You are a true scientist and a talented artist.' Father's words lifted me, filled me to the brim. This is what I want to be. Father, I'm certain I want to work at the museum. I want to be a taxidermist. I feel it in my heart. I will study very hard. I will do everything I can to make this transcendental art." Now let's hear some South Australian stories. Paul Lawson joined the museum in 1936. He made the news when he reconstructed the extinct Kangaroo Island emu, which had been discovered in 1802 by Matthew Flinders on his ship Investigator. He also made the papers when Somerton Man was found lifeless on Somerton Beach in 1948, and Paul was asked to make an accurate plaster cast of the face and body. A museum tweet in 2021 says that during this procedure, Paul became aware of aspects of the case which had escaped police attention, such as his developed legs. Paul became a key figure in the search for clues. And when the case was revived in the last few years, Paul was called upon once again in his late 90s and gave extraordinary assistance. From a professional to an amateur, the library has an oral history interview with Joy Wheaton of Kangaroo Island, who talks about her 15 years of amateur taxidermy and that she was self-trained by a state library manual and coached later by professionals. The library also has a 9-page article she wrote about her life in taxidermy, which I've transcribed and you can read it on the catalogue. She writes, "Early in 1954, I was asked to do an arrangement of native flowers for a flower day in Kingscote. What followed, I've never fully understood. Words came out of my mouth, words that must have been fermenting in my brain for many years. Could I have animals among the flowers? Of course, what a good idea. Was it? What had I let myself in for? There was so much to be learnt, where to start. The Adelaide Library loaned me 2 books on taxidermy. Having learnt so much, I needed more, so wrote to the museum asking if they would help. Of course they would. Just imagine my surprise and delight when I was directed to Paul Lawson. Mr. Lawson demonstrated for me how to skin a parrot." So no wonder Paul Lawson got an MBE for services to taxidermy and showing such kindness to people. and the family donated his medal to the State Library. Here he is at the age of 103. Did you know him, Joe? Oh, oh, lovely. The library also has 11 minutes of film footage of taxidermy of birds at the South Australian Museum from 1946. And thanks to the wonders of reformatting technology, we've put it onto our YouTube site. But a warning, it has very graphic content. Now, all the words in the long contents description, like cormorants, are keyword searchable in the catalogue. So to find it, at the top of the library's homepage is the catalogue, and our YouTube site is towards the bottom. And on our stories page, you can find the background to the tiger that's in the museum. Now, taxidermied animals are considered works of art and can be found in homes and businesses. Rizzoli, the art house publishers, produced this magnificent book. It says the first platypus skin was sent to Europe in 1798, but scientists at the time didn't believe that such an animal could exist and believed it to be a fake made of various animals sewn together. Zebras are favourites of interior designers because of their striking pattern, and a taxidermied pet cat with rat adds humour to a flat in Chelsea in London. Very fashionable. Nicholas Folland is an Australian artist who creates installations by repurposing things that are no longer fashionable, like the mounted deer heads with the chandeliers. And again, it's a very beautiful book. Julia Deville is an Australian silversmith and artist who won the South Australian Museum's Waterhouse Natural Science Art Prize in 2016 with the taxidermy chips in the soup ladle. And she calls it Neapolitan Bon Bonaparte. So I think it's a play on words Napoleon Bonaparte. And so Napoleon, we've got the pink cream and brown colours of Neapolitan ice cream that we used to love so much. And a bonbon is a small something. Does everybody go to see the Waterhouse exhibition at the museum each year? Yeah, it's fabulous. Jo Bain tells me that Julia Deville doesn't do her own taxidermy, but her artworks are spectacular anyway, like this chick in the ice cream scoop, and a pair of finches, and the rat saddled up. So taxidermy is alive and well around the world. There's a guild of taxidermists in the United Kingdom, a National Taxidermist Association in the United States, and an Australian Association of Wildlife Artists. And last weekend, they held their 2023 Taxidermy Championships, and Best in Show had a bush tucker theme with witchetty grubs and a lizard and a quandong tree. Now, it's amazing when you get interested in something, you notice things on that topic all over the place. So in a dress shop in Stirling were these fabric animals that looked for all the world like taxidermy. Now I'm going to close with a loony cartoon outside William and Gladys Weasel's World of Taxidermy shop. There are not too many people in the world right now, Gladys, who can go home at the end of the day happy in the knowledge that everything is completely stuffed. Thank you. And now we're having a brief pause while I get de-mic'd and Joe gets mic'd, and we'll pull his display out. Whoops.
Okay. All right. Okay, it's all working. No problem. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you to Carolyn for that lovely talk. Mine's going to be nowhere near as precise and well thought out. I've been known as a curator of chaos, so it's going to be a bit of a trip. Now, as you saw, with the museum's only had very few taxidermists in its time, and I'm quite lucky in that I worked with Winston Head for many years, who was a mentor for probably 20 years. Paul Lawson used to come in and chat regularly. He was a lovely man. I once met Alan Raw, who was Otto's son, and it was pointed out to me before I met him that he was a thoroughly unpleasant man. And I couldn't believe it, because he was such a lovely older fellow. He was like your grandfather. But he walked in while I was doing some taxidermy on an echidna. When you're doing taxidermy on mammals, you sculpt a body. This was a sculpted polyurethane body that I was fitting the skin to. And I'll change the language because it was pretty coarse. But he walked in and said, "What are you frickin' doing?" He didn't say frickin', okay? And I said, "This is what I'm doing. I'm mounting an echidna." He says, "What a load of bloody nonsense." He says, "In my day, we'd just rip them out the guts, pull everything out, pack them full of hay, nail their feet to the floor, pat them on the sides, and it's done. None of this garbage," I'll say that. So he was an interesting man, and he was, a product of his time. Nowadays, everything is done with synthetic resins, and it's much more high tech. Now, the purpose of a taxidermist at the museum goes well beyond just stuffing possums. What we have is a modern museum. Sorry, I'm getting a bit of feedback. Is that normal?
You're sounding fine.
It's all right. So at the museum, anything you see in a glass case usually starts off with me. So skeletal articulation, model making, taxidermy, reproduction of invertebrates and fossils all falls under my gamut. And along the way, I've done some pretty interesting things. Now, I brought along this fish. This is from home. This is one of the first taxidermy objects that I have that survived. This is a stonefish that a friend of mine caught in the Northern Territory, and I did this when I was 15. Now, it is a skinned fish, and that makes it quite fragile. And even back as far as the 19th century, they were saying that skinning fish was too difficult and not worth the trouble. So in museums, we mould and cast them in synthetic resins. Originally, they were cast in plaster, but that becomes a real problem when you've got small animals and delicate fins. So on this little bit of jetty pylon, that little fish there, the butterfly fish, was the first animal I actually did for the museum. And it's a tiny little juvenile butterfly fish, and everyone can come up and have a look at stuff when we're done, but I'd just ask you not to handle them because these things are quite fragile. Now, the reason we do fish like this is because with synthetic resins, you can have clear fins. You can't do that with plaster. They last a long time, and when they're properly moulded and cast, they've got more detail than a mounted fish. One of the things that doesn't happen with stonefish, but happens with ordinary fish, is scales are cup-shaped and they overlap. Now, when they dry, they flatten, because when skin dries, it goes tight and flattens, and the scales then curl, so you end up with a fluffy fish. So back in the 19th century, they said, "This is garbage, do it with plaster." We've moved on from that. Now, one of the things that's really quite extraordinary is once you start working with synthetic resins, the possibilities are endless. So when we look at things like reptiles, we do them by that method now. One thing I failed to mention, Carolyn talked about Beasley. He was an extraordinary taxidermist, but also a bit of a character. There's all sorts of stories around the museum of him maybe drinking on the job would be the best way to put it. We've got a moose in the mammal gallery that has a crooked neck because he rode it while he was naked. If anyone's ever patted a moose, they've got hair like a yard broom. It's spiky, it's unpleasant, and I wouldn't want my nether regions in contact with that. But he did, while abusing patrons and staff at the museum. He was sent back shortly after that. That story was in the paper several years ago, and I was quoted as telling the story, and I actually got an apology from his great-great-great-grandson, Peter Beasley, who thought he owed all of South Australia an apology, so you've had it, all right? And he hopes to come to South Australia to see some of his work at some stage. So Peter's a lovely fellow, but he was deeply ashamed of his great-grandfather's antics. So one of the things for me is I got into this simply because I was the sort of kid who was always around animals. And I mean, Skylar has my son's rat, Rose, at the moment. I mean, I've always been brought up around animals. And so the impetus for me doing what I do has never been about trophies. It's always been about showing people how wonderful our wildlife is and why we need to protect it. I mean, if you don't know what's around you, there's no way you're going to protect it. And so I started my career in taxidermy at the age of 10 with my head out the side of the car whenever we'd go for a drive, looking for dead things on the side of the road. Simply because I don't like the idea of killing things. That's how I'd obtain my specimens. And to this day, it's how I obtain my specimens, as well as cooperation with people who keep native animals, wildlife parks. The zoo is a great source and has always been a great source for the museum. So that's how I get what I get. Now, I was presented with a problem where somebody had broken into a case at the museum many years ago and stolen our thorny display. Sorry. And so this is a mounted thorny mountain devil. That was our original one was stolen. And so the curator of reptiles said to me, "Oh, don't worry, next time I'm up north, I'll grab you one, I'll bring it back, and you can knock it on the head and skin it." And I think I was about 20. 20-year-old me said, "No way, it's not happening." And so one of the things we have in the museum, which is an extraordinary resource, is wet specimens, specimens preserved in alcohol, and we've got jars of them. And so they form a library of where those species occur, and it's part of the scientific collection that's incredibly valuable. And so what I did at that age is look for materials that I could mould these preserved specimens with and find a casting method so I could get an accurate cast from that. And so that wasn't as easy as it sounds, because when you preserve stuff in alcohol, you dissolve all sorts of compounds within the bodies, and those compounds make most moulding compounds not set. So eventually I found a mixture of materials, and so this is the Thorny Mountain Devil. This is the first one from that method that I made to replace that stolen animal. You okay there, Skylar? Yeah. No worries. I just got to keep an eye, because if Rose wants to get out, there could be trouble. So this Thorny Mountain Devil is about nearly 40 years old now, and so it's lasted pretty well. It's one of the good things about moulding and casting. If you're in a position where you need to get, say we needed a dozen Thorny Mountain Devils on display, you just wipe out Thorny Mountain Devils from Central Australia. But what I do now is cast them. They've got a little wire skeleton inside them, so I can pose them any way I need to, and then they're painted. And so what you end up with is an animal that looks better than, you see the difference. It looks better, it lasts longer, it's not going to be subjected to insect attack, and we haven't caused a local extinction, because I love reptiles almost more than anything. So that's the basic method for reptiles. I do the same thing with invertebrates, with most invertebrates. Some invertebrates you can't do it with. Most people who go to the museum would be familiar with the giant squid exhibit. And this is the first model I presented to our new director at the time, with Tim Flannery. This is back in, I think, 99 or 2000. And we just had a new Aboriginal gallery redeveloped, but they wanted to put in a new lift. Now, the new lift was 2 centimetres larger than the old lift. So they boarded up the old lift shaft and built a new one, which is so sensible. And I thought, well, the lift shaft presents an opportunity. We can do something really cool with it. And so I had been reading about giant squid and found that they have a balance organ in the tip of their tail. Now, most animals have a balance organ, and we've got little rocks in our ears that help us balance. That's always kept upright. And giant squid are no exception. And some of the new footage shows them, well, sightings had shown them swimming upright rather than horizontally like a squid. I know it sounds silly. They don't swim like that. They tend to swim up and down. And so they arise at night to capture prey and then sort of slowly descend back down, but don't travel a lot like a general squid does. And so I thought, well, if we've got this huge vertical shaft, why not build a squid and all his little friends in there? So when Tim started, he said to me, is there anything you've ever wanted to do? And I sat down and I said, well, this is it. And he just looked at me like I was insane. And I gave him the model and he sat it on his desk for a while and he came back to me and started making notes. And I said to him, is everything okay? He's saying, yeah. I just need to write down everything you say. And I got a bit scared. And I said, am I in trouble? He said, no. I'm going to go out and pitch this to people, but I need to know exactly what you want to do. And so he went out and within a couple of weeks had the money and I started it. And so what we've got here, this is one of the things they don't tell you is that you can't buy glass eyes for a giant squid. And so everything in that lift shaft I had to make by hand. We've got animals that have been brought up from a couple of kilometres underwater, and I don't know if you've ever worked with fish. They have a swim bladder. When you bring them up from the depths, they go bang. And so what you end up with, instead of something that should be a fish, it looks like an evil mess that smells like fish. And so I had to rebuild a lot of these animals. We had heads and we had tails and not much in between because they go bang. And so those animals were rebuilt. The squid had to be built from scratch because we have a preserved one, but the preserved one does not look great, especially after it's been dissected. So working with all those photographs, moulding tentacles, and then rebuilding all that stuff, we ended up with that exhibit. So that's that. Now, I'm just checking my notes to make sure I haven't forgotten anything. Okay, I've got a quiz. Can anyone guess what this is? Pardon?
Is it R-rated?
Perhaps, yes. Has anyone seen the 1962 movie Hatari with John Wayne? Yeah? You know, Henry Mancini wrote The Elephant Walk for that, right? And the elephant that walked in under that music was an animal called Congo, who spent his days at Taronga Park Zoo. Congo died, and during Tim Flannery's time, one of the exhibitions we were going to put on is the penis exhibition. This is the tip of Congo's penis. And that's, under Tim Flannery at the museum, it was a pretty chaotic time. I was in Sydney for something else. Congo had died. I was talking to the people at the museum about this penis exhibition we wanted to do. And they said, oh, you have to have Congo's dick. And I said, okay. I don't have any way of getting it home. I'm catching a plane tonight. And they said, oh, surely you've got a bag. And I said, I've got my hand luggage, mate. And so what I had to do is put on 3 days worth of t-shirts and jocks, take this penis, fold it up, put it in my carry-on bag and freeze it. And so in the evening, I went to the museum, I grabbed this 25 kilo lump, which, you know, carry-on is only meant to be 5 kilograms, and tried to look carefree and how light it was when I walked through the gate. Now, it's a funny thing, you know, you're sitting on a plane for an hour and your bag is defrosting in front of you and you can see condensation and water pooling around the floor of the aircraft. And I'm thinking, oh shit, I'm going to be in so much trouble. And then I had a paranoid thought, what about the sniffer dogs at the airport? I had the paperwork that said I was allowed to have it, but I hadn't declared it. But I hadn't been asked if I had an elephant penis in my bag. Anyway, as it was, a brief call to Tim from the airport, and he came and picked me up because I was very concerned about the federal police that were circling me. Now that, as an exhibition, the reason we wanted to do it is, it's a complicated subject. The penis is used in taxonomy as a diagnostic tool, and it first came across my understanding when people were describing this new species of bat. Now, we had 3 bats that were all thought to be the one species, and when they started looking at them, there were minute differences in terms of their genitalia size. Of the 3 bats, it was like, you know, Goldilocks and the 3 bears. There was a little one, a big one, and a medium-sized one. Now, the head researcher desperately wanted the one with the larger penis to be named after him. And so, during the preparation of the scientific text, that was the case. But when it was finally submitted, they changed it to one with the tiny penis. And so, when it was published, he was very upset. But that informed the researchers that there were these massive differences in terms of genitalia. And there's all sorts of interesting cultural associations and, you know, the men's health issue with men. I don't know if you've met any men, but they don't like going to the doctor, especially about that sort of thing. So the idea was it would have this multifaceted approach to what a penis is and how you should look after it. Now, one of the things that came up during that exhibition was I put the call out to the zoo. Anything that's dead that has an interesting penis, I want it. Now, because I'm the one doing this, not the scientists, I have the world's worst nickname at the zoo. I met this lovely vet nurse the other day, and as I was shaking her hand, the head vet said, "You know who this is?" And she said, "Pardon?" "This is Joe Bain from the museum." And she went, "Oh, you're Dick Man." So that's my nickname at the zoo, unfortunately. This next, and so that involved some pretty interesting and probably terrifying moments in my life. My brother and I always, as kids, wanted to go and see orangutans in the wild. And when I rang him to tell him they were putting one under and I had to mould its penis, he really wanted to be there. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen one up close. I have swum with white pointers, and I've played with blue-ring octopus and death adders and the works, but I have never been more scared in my life than dealing with an orang. I got to the zoo, I had the alginate I was going to use to mould his penis. The problem is, there was no problem yet, but the only thing that he would be left with is a slightly minty smelling penis after I did my job, right? So that was the plan. I also took along a couple of trays to mould his hands. I thought we'd mould his hands and his feet at the same time while he was under. Now these trays were 50 centimetres long. When I got there, I got the warm water for the alginate, got everything laid out, was ready to go. They went and darted the animal, but I don't know if you dealt with orangs, but like all primates, he was darted, he picked it out and threw it back at the keeper. Now, because they darted him, they couldn't dart him immediately because they didn't want a double dose of sedative. So they waited. And so while we're waiting, I'm standing there with a friend of mine saying, "Yeah, I'm a little bit worried about this," and I could feel my heart going. I said, if something goes wrong, I'm finding a way to climb inside that frickin' filing cabinet because I don't want this thing to get me, you know? And my uncle was a zookeeper, and I've been regaled with tales of how when the chimps get out, they hunt people down. So I was on edge, shall we say. Now, this went on for a while. Finally, the dump truck backs up, and I'm horrified to see they've got this ape on a stretcher, and there's this tiny little female vet sitting on top of his chest talking to him. These guys then bring him in, so you've got 4 guys on each end of the stretcher carrying him at shoulder height. And she's on his chest, talking to him, calming him down. Because I thought when they put something out, it was asleep. He wasn't. And he was lolling around. He sees someone he doesn't know. He grabs them by the neck and picks them up so he can have a look at them. This fellow is now 60 centimetres off the floor, and then drops him. They put him on this bench, and 2 men on each side, so 4 men are holding his arms, because with an orang, you know, he might only weigh 90 kilos, but nearly 60 of those arms, they're just extraordinarily built. There was a Malaysian guy standing next to me, and he's going, "Oh no." And I look at him, and I said, "What's wrong?" He says, "Oh, it's too many men. It's too many men." I said, "What does that mean?" He says, "Oh, last time he was around this many men, he put 4 people in hospital." I was like, "Oh." And all the keepers that were just standing there having a gawk, just straight out of the room. So I'm standing there, and I was told, just hold off. And I don't know if you've met the zoo vet, Schultz. He's the loveliest man, but probably the most accurate description is that he's a psycho. You know, he's absolutely insane. And he says to me, "Bain, don't touch his dick until I say go." The female vet that was, you know, doing stuff and, you know, keeping him calm, walks up to me at one point and says, "Are you scared?" And I said, "I am a bit." She says, "You should be. You have no idea how dangerous this is." Okay. He says, "See the hand?" And by this stage, I'd already tried out my trays to see if I could mould his hand. They were too small. And these were 50 centimetres long, right? So his hands were massive. She says, "See the hand?" I said, "Yep." "And see the penis?" I said, "Yeah." She says, "If you're working and he grabs you, you're stuffed." She didn't use that word. "And we can do nothing for you, because if he gets you, you're dead." Oh. Oh. Schultz says, "Go," I go. I start mixing up my alginate, I'm spreading it on poor orangutan pubes, and I'm doing what I'm doing. But the problem is, because we'd waited so long, this water wasn't warm anymore. And I guess most men in the room would know, no one likes cold water in that area of the body. So he's grabbing for it all the time, so I'm having to sort of get my arm out of the way. And so this went on for a while, and Schultz is saying, "Is it setting?" And I'm going, no. And what's happening is he's waking up more. And so he's going, and as he's doing that, he's lifting 4 men off the ground. And so they're trying to bring other people in. But everyone now is too scared to walk into the room with it. And so it's finally starting to set. And Schultz says, "Okay, get it off." And I go to pull it off. And because it's sat on there for so long, it's penetrated all his hair and it will not come off. And so now I am pulling the pubes of an animal that can tear my head off. So I'm trying to get it off. Schultz throws a pair of scissors at me and says, "Cut it off." And so I'm gently trying to do this. This animal was for a breeding program, and now I'm terrified I'm going to cut his penis off. So I get it off. I walk back to work shaking, and I do the cast. This is it. And honestly, a toddler would be embarrassed to have a penis this size. So you can have a look at that later on. Unfortunately, the penis exhibition didn't go ahead. It would have been hilarious, but yeah. Now, one of the other jobs we do in taxidermy, or museum taxidermists do, is a lot of model making. And some of my favourite stuff has been plesiosaurs. I'll go over here with these guys. And so typically, you end up with remains that are really badly damaged. And that's the snout of, the head of Umunosaurus, which is a South Australian plesiosaur, best known as Eric. It's in the Sydney Museum. And so traditionally, you'd end up with this, and there's bits of his head missing, and so you just mirror these bits to rebuild the skull, all right? And from that, you go ahead and build the reconstruction. And that's how I did Chrissy, who's on display, and the Umunosaurs. Chrissy was named after a rock star called Christina Amphlett, who, I don't know if anyone was familiar with her, but she had these terrible teeth that would stick out like this. She had them fixed several times, but they kept sticking out. So this old girl had teeth the same, and so her name's Chrissy. Now, in the years since I did Chrissy, which was 2000, a few years ago we had an opal exhibition, and I built a new plesiosaur based on the St Albans plesiosaur, which is, again, it's an animal that's on display on level 3. It's the only specimen of its type in the world. The original skull, unfortunately, when we're excavating, was backed over by a bulldozer. And so all we have is teeth and partial skull remains. And so I rebuilt this. So apart from sculpting in clay and wax and all the rest of it, I also do digital sculpting. So this was sculpted digitally and then 3D printed. So we have a plastic skull that I could then rebuild all the muscles on to create the animal. So that's another part of my job. Now, recently, was it last year, Justine, the flamingos went on? 21? I know, it's all a bit of a blur, especially with COVID. So the zoo's flamingos were thought to be a pair of males. This is the internal body from Chile. Oh, there we go. So they shared a pen together for many, many years. With a flamingo, one of the problems you've got, well, there are myriad problems, but these animals were incredibly old, and I guess anyone who's dealt with old people, skin gets brittle. That's certainly true with birds. Bird skin is very fragile. When you're doing taxidermy, they're really fine skin, and you've got to be very, very careful. But when you've got an animal that has exceeded its natural life by, some time, it's actually really hard to work on. With Greater especially, Greater was very, very old, much older than he should have been. I mean, the Basel Zoo in Switzerland is normally the gold standard for animal care, and they say a flamingo's maximum age is 60 years. Now we know Greater was at least 83, right? And that's testament to just how good our zoo is. I mean, they really took care of that animal. I saw his medical records for the last 15 years, the last 15 years of his life, and he was looked after better than most people will ever be looked after. And as a result, he had this exceptional life. Now, when they came to me, they weren't in the best condition. I mean, apart from being dead, they did post-mortems on them to check how their general health was. I mean, why they had to PM Greater was a bit of a mystery to me, but they did. And so they messed up a lot of his feathers. Chili was really bad. I don't know, they need to sharpen their knives. She was a bit of a mess. And during that dissection, they actually found that Chili was female. I mean, it was always thought to be male because she'd never laid eggs. And because of that, they were gay icons. But Chili is female, and one of the big problems you've got with birds is that there has to be a wire that goes down the leg into the base. All the mounted flamingos I'd seen, when you do that with a flamingo, because they've got such incredibly thin legs, you run this wire down the back of the leg and you end up deforming the leg. It looks like a figure 8 instead of just a leg. And so I developed this method for moulding the original legs, inserting these wires, then pouring this, flexible resin on top. And so what it means is we've got no distortion in the legs at all. We've got legs that match the original legs that don't shrink, because in birds, that leg, you can't get in there to fill anything, so they shrink a lot. And it's one of the routes where insect pests get in. One of the constant problems, I mean, I mentioned it earlier, is insect pests within a museum. Carpet beetles, little things called thrips, all sorts of things get in and they eat skins or the fur or the feathers or both. And so one of the things was two such iconic animals, and the last flamingos in Australia, I could not afford to mess them up. And so I practiced on ibises for a while, just to get the technique and check that everything would work. And so what we've got here is what is inside Chili. This was a cast that didn't come out as well as I wanted, so I've kept it for these sorts of purposes. But Chili has like a polyurethane foam body. Polyurethane is really good because you can nail into it and you can glue the skin to it, which was necessary in some parts. The neck The neck that's in the animal is actually a flexible polyurethane because it means I could then pose it. And the head was completely cast as well. So what I did, and if you want a job that is going to give you nerves, cutting around the feathered edges of the skin around a bird, just to completely cut that out so you can mould the beak and all the fleshy bits, like his eyelids and his and her eyelids. Because one of the things that's really marvellous about these birds is when you start looking at them, is that they have, because they're so old, they've got incredible detail in those faces. They have, most people get a bit vain and don't like lines and wrinkles, but these things were so beautiful because they had those things. And so I wanted to retain that. It's one of the things you lose when you're doing conventional taxidermy. So these animals were done in this fairly unique way. I don't know of anyone doing this in a museum before. So what we've got is a synthetic head, glass eyes, synthetic legs. The only bones that were retained were the wing bones, simply because all the primaries and secondaries actually attached to the bone, and so removing that would mean the wings would not sit right. So they're a fairly unique mount, and they came out quite well, but they were a nightmare. Grater's skin in particular, when you skin a bird, the skin is thin but flexible and stretchy. If you just let his skin just lay over like that, it would snap. It was so brittle and old. And it wasn't through lack of moisture, it was just the fact that it was such old skin. And so it had to be done in an unbroken sitting, the skinning, and then he was washed and then put away because I was about to have a nervous breakdown, and then get him out to do the mounting, and that had to occur in one sitting as well, which took probably about 11 hours to get the skin on him and get it right. And that's then, because I'm employing a weird method, where the skin meets the skull, I'd have to then do a little bit of micro drying and then glue it with super glue around all those features in the skull. And if you look at them today, it's very hard to tell that it's not its original beak or legs. He had a couple of little, Grater especially, had a couple of little defects in the scales on his leg. We made sure we kept all of that. We wanted him to look exactly like he was when he was alive, simply because most museums tend to do generic animals, You want it to look the best it possibly can. I thought it was more important for him to look like him and for Chili to look like her, because simply they'd been part of so many people's lives for so many years, it was important to do that. Now, one thing I might touch on just before I go is most people look at taxidermy and think, well, yeah, it's all fine to be in a museum, but it doesn't do anyone any real good, does it? We all know what's going on in Ukraine with the Russian forces and the rest of it. Now, the Bushmaster vehicles that are serving in Ukraine, which have been praised by the Ukrainians as being really very special, have got a link to here as well. I received a phone call years ago, this is probably in the late 90s, from a fellow who worked for the Defence Science and Technology Organisation. He introduced himself and he said he worked in weapons systems in the specialist area of terminal effects. It's like, oh, okay. And wanted to know if there's anyone at the museum who knew about making bones and stuff out of plaster. And I said, well, we haven't used plaster for about 100 years. I use synthetic resins and I, blend them depending on, what sort of properties you want. He said, oh, well, that's good. And so I was seconded to the military for probably about 2 years, building bioresponsive human limbs to look at countermeasures to landmines and things. And so what would happen is, I've got a couple here. Whoops. Human femur. I did have whole legs, but I threw them out years ago. So femur and a tibia, right? And so the thing that's interesting about this, we've got, wonderful collections of remains in our collection from all over the world. And so we chose a Caucasian skeleton that was the size of the average soldier. I moulded all the bones in the legs. We then, this is where it gets bizarre, they then had muscles made of gelatin with skin made of chamois that was impregnated with gelatin. These things were then put in a truck and subjected to blasts from an equivalent from an IED. So I helped pack some of the explosives, about 14 kilograms of plastic explosives that we put under the wheel of this truck and then blown up. And then afterwards, these legs would be dissected by a trauma surgeon to see what sort of damage occurred. And so we had all the usual stuff, you know, spiral fractures and all sorts of terrible things that would happen. And so then we had to modify the trucks to make sure that these things didn't happen. Now, I didn't do any of the welding or anything, but these guys filled tyres with water so that would absorb some of the blast. They'd put plating underneath to deflect the blast. And that's what led to the development of those vehicles. And so while I can't claim responsibility for that, I did have a small part in testing whether these things would work. So it's not just for pretty stuff in the museum, it actually has real world applications as well. So when you see things like Mythbusters and they have the gelatin bits with the bone inside, that's a bastardised derivative of the work we did on this. So I'd like to say thank you for everyone today, and yeah, thank you. I'd like to say thank you to Carolyn for reaching out for this. So thank you.
And thank you so much for being here, and thank you, Joe, very much for everything you've done. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Now, if anybody would like to ask any questions or make any comments, we're happy to be here for another half hour or so. You've got things to have a look at. You've got the exhibit outside. Would anybody like to ask Joe a question?
Yes. Yes.
So, are they the real feathers?
Oh yes, yeah. All the feathers are real. I mean, one of the problems with all mounted birds is that beaks shrink and the skin, if you've got bare skin, shrinks, and so you lose all those features, you know, like wrinkles that are, I think, really important. With the legs, they contract around the bones, and so they tend to mummify more than anything. You can't actually get in there to do any work on them. So they're the problem areas. The skin itself, you know, shrinks and dries onto the form. That's why your form needs to be accurate. But the feathers are all original, all embedded in their original way. Chili had some problems in that she had some feathers that were cut because of the way they opened her up, that we had to sort of then preen her a certain way to make her look better than she would have ordinarily. And when I say things like that, I'm not criticising the zoo staff at all, because I mean, they do their thing and I do mine, and my area is more specialised than a general dissection. So yeah, they're all the real feathers, and they haven't been recoloured in any way. They've been washed simply because, you know, they got a bit dirty toward the end of their life, and especially when you PM something, there's a lot of blood. So removing that from those white feathers was, wow, a challenge. Yeah. No problem. Yes?
More of a historical question. So when we had the trend being stuffing animals and sticking them here, there and everywhere, have you got any research that tells you any of the animals that actually became extinct because of that fashion?
Yeah.
I certainly haven't gone looking for that. I wouldn't have thought so. Not on the basis of fashion.
While
Not like the Tasmanian tiger that was hunted to extinction for economic reasons.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't have said for fashionable reasons.
Yeah, no, I would have said also, I mean, the fact that certainly you'd put a population under pressure from that, but extinctions tend to occur for other reasons other than that. I mean, when you look at things like passenger pigeons in the US that we use extensively for sending messages, you know, because they were being used like that, they exterminated them to stop other people from getting messages through. So there are a couple of taxidermy specimens in collections, but that's not the main reason. It's yeah, I can't think of anything that's been done in that way at all. Yeah, but certainly, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I have not dealt with hunters when I was doing some private work. You know, when I didn't have a job at the museum, I wouldn't do that sort of thing simply because I don't like the idea of you decimating populations just for a keepsake. Yeah, I don't know. Yes.
Now this is often a bit of a tangent, but as we're talking about feathers, I've had something I've wondered about for a long time. Just as all zebras have different stripes and we all have different fingertips, do all pigeons have unique feather patterns?
I don't know about all of them, but certainly it's pretty diverse. I mean, it's very hard to find two exactly alike. I mean, I know, and that's one of the reasons why we keep collections at the museum. You know, if you, you know, researchers, you know, tend to do that sort of analysis, but I don't think they'd be identical at all. And even with birds or animals that you think look alike, I mean, most people would look at one possum and say, oh, it's the same as that possum. But one of the things I find in my work is that the differences are minute, but they're all there. I mean, just the same as people are individual. So I wouldn't have thought so, for sure. And even things like koalas all have different fingerprints, you know? So, yeah, once you start seeing those sorts of differences, you understand that they're far more diverse than what they look like on the surface. Yeah.
I have a question.
Oh.
What do you know about the Tantanoola tiger?
Not really a tiger, and not a wolf. When it came in a few years ago for some repairs, it's a large dog.
Oh.
Yeah. It's a dog. Yeah, it's a dog. Yes?
Are you training once you replace it?
No. Yeah, there's currently not sort of funding to do that. Yeah, well, it was a concern of our previous head of the board, Jane Smith, financed a position for a couple of years to train someone, but that funding came to an end, unfortunately. Yeah, it does worry me a bit. I mean, I'm 58 now, and I guess I've got a few years left, but not a huge amount.
You need an apprentice.
Yeah.
Boy.
But I'm hopeful we'll get someone. Yes?
Just in terms of removing blood from the feathers.
Yes.
So I've worked with like white rabbits and mice, and usually just dish soap is enough to sort of get a lot of staining out. But I was wondering if we needed more chemical-based cleaners for the feathers, or whether it was
No.
Do you want to repeat the question, Joe?
Yeah, well, the question was how hard is it to get blood out of feathers, and do you use chemicals other than dish soap? I tend to not even use dish soap. One of the things I've found, just tepid water is usually enough if you're very careful brushing the feathers. Anything more than that is going to cause problems. One of the issues with all animals is when you're doing taxidermy, you're just using that top layer of skin, and there's a fine layer of fat that's attached to that, and we try and remove all of that, but it's there on a sort of a chemical level bonded with the tissue. Once you start introducing detergents, those lipids start being partially dissolved, and that can cause you get that partial saponification that just makes a mess of the feathers, and they end up being disgusting. So I just tend to use water, and yeah, it tends to work pretty well. In really extreme cases, I might use dilute hydrogen peroxide, but only in like 2% concentration. Any more than that, it starts breaking down the skin. So you've got to be very, very careful.
And Joe, did you study science at school to get all this knowledge?
Yeah, it's a funny one because I was my school's top science student. I was obsessive. But when I started doing work experience at the museum, and I started doing it when I was 15, they said to me, oh no, you need an arts degree.
What?
And I was horrified because I dropped art as soon as I could because I thought it was garbage. And then I had to sort of take it back up and yeah, get back into it. And then do fine art at SA College of Advanced Education when it was down at Underdale. So it was, that was a bit of a trip because it was not what I expected. I thought a science background would be, but I've got
really
the best of both.
taxidermy is a marriage of art and craft and science, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It's all
and
three.
Technically it was invented to aid zoologists because, you know, these animals aren't going to survive these trips back to England, you know, to be described.
Yep.
And so taxidermy was there to, you know, preserve these animals so they could be described by the scientists of the day.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking of Sir Hubert Wilkins, the great South Australian polar explorer. He learned how to taxidermy, so when he was finding specimens to send back to the British Museum, he did his own taxidermy. So it was a practical thing that people out in the field had to be able to
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes.
Have you got anything that's waiting sort of in the freezer?
Oh yeah.
Like what do you really? What do you want?
I can see my boss shaking her head.
What's something you really
Am I allowed to say, Justine?
like to do? Go on.
I mean, I have a great hope that I want to enhance certain areas of the museum, and I've been on a bit of a bender finding really good foreign reptiles because I'd like to augment one part of the collection. So I've got an anaconda in the freezer, which is so sexy, but it's rolled up. It looks like a pair of truck tires. You know, it's really big. It's like this round, and it takes, I think, 6 people to lift it. I've got an Aldabran tortoise which weighs well over half a tonne. It's just bigger than, as big as the table. And I've got cantils and cottonmouths and all sorts of really, really good venomous things in the freezer. I've been trying to gather this material to work on this exhibition, and I can't probably say much more than that. What's that? Oh yeah, I love snakes. I've got a real thing. I've always kept snakes as pets, and I just have a big affinity for them. And so, you know, having those foreign reptiles would be really important for what we're maybe planning on doing one day. I can't say definitely, but maybe. Yeah.
Oh, one more.
Be careful keeping snakes and a rat.
Well, yes. At home at the moment, I've got a snake, a rat, and a greyhound. The rat puts the greyhound in its place. You know, she'll smack him and try and bite his nose. Reg, the snake, I've had since he was 2 days old. He is not a threat to anything. I actually have to hold him and put the food in his mouth, otherwise he won't eat. He lacks all sorts of aggression. He's hopeless.
Actually,
but lovely, you know.
One way of overcoming your fear of snakes, I live up in the hills and I've got brown snakes, so I'm terrified of them. But I went to the show a few years ago and they had more like a python.
Yeah.
And you're allowed to touch it, and I stroked this thing and it was warm and soft. Yeah. And ever since then I've lost my paranoia about snakes. Yeah. Just touching one, you know. Yeah. They're people too.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much everybody for coming.